Little girl told Vampire King, "I'll be your queen someday." 20 years later, she returned in chains. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The wind howled through the streets of the small village as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the worn cobblestone paths. In this quiet town, life was simple and dreams were few. But for one little girl, life had always been different. From the moment she could speak, she had made one promise that would change her life forever. As a child, she often wandered into the woods, away from her humble cottage, to gaze at the distant castle on the hill. It was said to belong to the Vampire King, a mysterious and powerful figure who ruled the land with an iron fist. The townsfolk spoke of him in hushed tones, warning children to stay away from the shadows of his kingdom. But this young girl was different. She was curious, and unlike the other children, she wasn't afraid. One fateful day, while playing near the forest edge, she found herself caught in a dangerous storm. The skies had turned dark and the wind whipped around her, causing trees to bend and snap. As the rain poured down, she sought shelter under a large oak tree. It was there that she first encountered him, the Vampire King. He appeared from the shadows, his eyes glowing an eerie red, and his presence commanded the air around them to grow colder. He was tall, his features sharp and regal, like something out of a dream or a nightmare. The little girl, soaked to the bone and trembling from both the cold and the fear, looked up at him with wide eyes. In that moment, she wasn't afraid. Instead, she simply said, "I'll be your queen someday." The words tumbled from her mouth without thought, but they were spoken with such sincerity that they surprised even her. The Vampire King paused, his gaze narrowing as he studied her. For a long moment, the world seemed to stand still. He knelt down, his cold fingers brushing her wet hair, and a small, amused smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "Someday, little one," he asked, his voice deep and ancient. "Do you truly think so?" She nodded, her small face filled with determination. "Yes, I will be your queen, and we will rule together." The Vampire King studied her for a moment longer before standing up, his eyes softening ever so slightly. He said nothing but turned and disappeared into the storm, leaving her standing alone beneath the oak tree, her heart pounding. From that day on, she could not shake the feeling that something had shifted within her. She had no idea then, but those words would come to define her fate. Years passed, and the girl grew into a young woman, still haunted by the memory of that strange encounter. She often found herself gazing up at the castle in the distance, wondering what might have been. But life in the village remained simple and difficult, and the dream of becoming a queen seemed like a distant fantasy, one that faded with each passing year. Little did she know, the Vampire King had never forgotten her promise. And one day, when she least expected it, the life she had dreamed of would return to claim her. But it would not be the fairy tale she had imagined. Instead, she would come back to the castle, not as a queen, but as a prisoner. Chains would bind her, and the life she thought was hers to take would be forever changed. The question was no longer about what would happen in the future, but what she would have to endure to reclaim her destiny. The years passed, and with each passing day, the little girl grew into a young woman. Her village, nestled deep in the forest, remained the same. The same old houses with straw roofs, the same dirt roads that turned to mud with the slightest rain. But for her, everything had changed. She had long since let go of the childish dream of becoming a queen, buried beneath the weight of daily struggles. She had learned that dreams are for the rich and powerful, not for those who work from sunrise to sunset just to scrape by. Yet, even though she had grown up, the memory of that encounter with the Vampire King stayed with her, tucked away in the corner of her heart. There was one thing, however, that had not changed. The castle on the hill, the very one she had once gazed at with innocent wonder, still stood tall and imposing, its dark towers piercing the sky like watchful sentinels. She could never forget that day when she had dared to speak the words that had unknowingly sealed her fate. "I'll be your queen someday." She often thought about that moment in the years that followed. What had driven her to say those words? Why had she spoken them with such certainty, even though she had no idea who the Vampire King truly was? Was it the storm, the strange pull she had felt in his presence, or something else? All she knew was that those words had left an indelible mark on her soul, a promise she had not fully understood. It wasn't until she was 20 that the full weight of her promise began to sink in. By then, life had shaped her into someone hardened by hardship, but still, the call of the castle lingered in her mind. One fateful evening, as she walked back from the market after a long day of labor, she saw it. A carriage, drawn by horses as dark as night, arrived at the village square. The horses' hooves clattered loudly on the cobblestones, and the carriage door swung open to reveal a tall, imposing figure. It was him, the Vampire King. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. He stepped out of the carriage, his crimson eyes scanning the crowd as if searching for something or someone. It was as if time itself had stopped. There, in the middle of the market, surrounded by bustling villagers, the world felt incredibly small, as if only she and he existed. The Vampire King's gaze met hers, and for a brief moment, she could see the flicker of recognition in his eyes. The years seemed to melt away. He had not forgotten her. But she had changed, and so had he. Gone was the mystery of the tall, dark stranger. In his place stood the ruler of the Vampire Kingdom, a being whose power could command the skies to fall. The Vampire King took a step toward her, his presence almost suffocating. The villagers around her stepped back, their eyes filled with fear and awe, but she remained still, unable to move. His voice broke the silence. "You," he said, his tone cold and distant. "You are the one who spoke those words all those years ago." She nodded, her throat tight. She had no idea why he was here, why he was looking at her this way, but something deep inside her told her that her life was about to change again, and not in the way she had ever imagined. The Vampire King's gaze softened slightly, his sharp features still unyielding. "You made a promise," he continued, his voice now laced with something she could not quite place. "And now, it is time to keep it." She stared at him, confusion filling her mind. Keep the promise? But she had no power, no influence. She was just a simple woman, struggling to survive in a village that barely offered enough to live on. How could she keep a promise to a being like him, a king who controlled everything around him? As if reading her mind, the Vampire King stepped closer. "You were never meant to be ordinary. You were meant for something far greater." He reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face, his touch sending a shiver down her spine. "You will come with me." Her mind raced. She had no choice. The promise she made as a child had led her to this very moment. The weight of destiny pressed down on her shoulders, but even in the face of uncertainty, she knew one thing. Her life would never be the same again. The villagers watched in silence as the Vampire King extended his hand, and the world around her seemed to fade. She had no idea what awaited her in the castle, but the chains she would wear were not just physical. They were the chains of fate, of a destiny she had long ago sealed with a simple, innocent promise. And now, she would have to face it. The journey to the Vampire King's castle was one she could not have prepared for. As the carriage rattled along the winding roads, the world outside seemed to fade into nothing. The familiar village, the life she had known for so long, was now a distant memory, lost behind the mist that surrounded her. She sat in silence, her mind racing, heart pounding in her chest. What had she gotten herself into? The words the Vampire King had spoken echoed in her head. Asterisk. You were never meant to be ordinary. You were meant for something far greater. Asterisk. She had never felt less extraordinary, trapped in a world that had always seemed too big for someone like her. And yet, here she was, being pulled into the heart of a kingdom she barely understood, under the rule of a man who was far more than just a king. She glanced out the small window of the carriage, catching a glimpse of the towering spires of the castle in the distance. It loomed above her, a symbol of power and mystery. The storm from earlier had cleared, but the air still felt thick, as if charged with an energy she could not comprehend. She felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The promise she had made all those years ago seemed like a distant echo. Was it possible that this was what she had truly wanted? To be a queen? To rule by his side? Or had she been naive, letting the words of a child guide her into this moment? As the carriage approached the castle gates, they creaked open, seemingly on their own accord. The sound of ancient iron groaning against the stone made her shiver, and she was suddenly aware of how small and insignificant she felt in the face of such immense power. The wheels of the carriage came to a halt, and the door was opened by a servant dressed in dark, ornate clothing. He was tall, his features sharp, with an air of indifference that made her feel even more out of place. "The king awaits," he said, his voice as cold as the stone walls surrounding them. She stepped out of the carriage, her legs feeling weak as she tried to steady herself. The air inside the castle was thick with the scent of aged wood and incense. The grand hall stretched out before her, its high ceilings adorned with ancient tapestries that told stories of wars long past. The marble floors gleamed in the dim light, and a chill seemed to hang in the air, as if the castle itself was alive with history, breathing and watching her every move. She took a deep breath and followed the servant down the long hallway, each step echoing off the stone walls. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat reminding her that she had no idea what was to come. They reached a massive set of doors, ornately carved with symbols she did not recognize. The servant knocked twice, then opened the door, stepping aside to let her enter. Inside, the vampire king sat upon a throne made of blackened stone, the room dimly lit by flickering candles. His presence filled the room, as commanding and powerful as ever. He was no longer the stranger she had met so many years ago. Now, he was a ruler, an immortal being whose power seemed to ripple through the air like a storm. His crimson eyes locked onto hers, and she felt a shiver run down her spine. "You've come," he said, his voice as smooth as velvet, yet laced with an undeniable edge. She nodded, unable to find her voice at first. "Yes," she whispered. "I've come to fulfill my promise." The vampire king's lips curved into a slight, almost imperceptible smile. "You have," he replied, his gaze never leaving hers. "But this is not the end of your journey. It is only the beginning." Her heart skipped a beat. She had thought that coming to the castle was the fulfillment of her promise, that somehow she had found the path to the destiny she had once dreamed of. But now, his words suggested that something far more complicated awaited her. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The vampire king rose from his throne, his movements fluid and graceful, as though he was made of shadows themselves. He stepped toward her, his eyes never leaving hers. "You were never meant to be a simple queen, little one," he said, his voice low and almost tender. "You are meant to rule at my side, yes. But not as you are now. You will need to prove yourself, to become more than you ever thought possible." Her heart raced as his words sank in. What did he mean by proving herself? What did he expect from her? And what was this power he spoke of? She had spent her entire life believing that power was something beyond her reach, something for the rich, the noble, the untouchable. But now, standing before the vampire king, she realized that perhaps power was not something granted to her by birthright. Maybe it was something she could take for herself. "Prove myself how?" she asked, her voice steadier than she had expected. The vampire king smiled, a dangerous glint flashing in his eyes. "You will learn in time. But first, you must accept who you truly are. You are not just any woman. You are a part of this world, a part of my world. And now, your true journey begins." His words hung in the air, and she felt a wave of realization wash over her. This was no fairy tale. This was a test of everything she had ever believed about herself, and a test of her strength, her will, and her willingness to embrace the darkness that was waiting for her. The days that followed were filled with uncertainty and confusion. The castle, once a distant and mysterious place, now felt like a prison, its cold stone walls pressing down on her. The vampire king had not spoken much after that first meeting, leaving her to wander the vast halls in silence. At first, she wondered if she had made the right choice, if the promise she had made all those years ago was really worth this strange and uncomfortable reality. The air in the castle seemed heavy with secrets, and each day she spent there, she felt more out of place. But then, one evening, something changed. As she walked through the long corridors, she was summoned to the throne room again. The vampire king was there, sitting on his stone throne, his crimson eyes gleaming in the dim light. This time, there was no coldness in his gaze. Instead, there was something else, an expectation. "Come closer," he commanded, his voice as smooth as ever. She hesitated for a moment, her heart racing, but she obeyed, stepping forward. The room was silent, save for the soft rustling of her footsteps. "You have been here long enough," the Vampire King said, his eyes never leaving her face. "It is time for you to learn the true nature of your power." Her breath caught in her throat. Her power. She had never thought of herself as powerful. She was just a girl from a small village, a girl who had made a childish promise to a king she barely knew. What did he mean by power? He continued, his voice growing softer. "You are not just a human. You are part of a lineage that goes back centuries, a lineage of warriors, of rulers. Your blood is more than ordinary, and now you must learn to wield it." She stared at him, trying to make sense of his words. Blood? Her blood? What was he talking about? "I don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. The Vampire King rose from his throne, his tall figure casting a shadow over her. "You will," he replied. "But first, you must accept the truth. You are destined for something greater than you ever imagined. You will become my queen, yes, but to do so, you must embrace the power that is within you." He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. His cold fingers brushed against her skin, sending a chill through her. "I will teach you," he said, his voice soft but insistent. "You must trust me, and you must trust yourself. Only then will you be ready to fulfill your promise." She stood there, frozen, as the weight of his words sank in. Could she really do this? Could she accept that her destiny was intertwined with his, that she was meant to rule by his side? She had spent so long doubting herself, thinking that she was just a simple girl with dreams too big for her to reach. But now, the reality was staring her in the face. The Vampire King was right. She was not just anyone. She was part of something much bigger than herself. And for the first time, she felt a flicker of something deep inside her. It was a feeling she had never experienced before, a sense of power, of potential. She could feel it, simmering just beneath the surface, waiting to be unleashed. "How do I begin?" she asked, her voice steady now, more confident than she had ever been. The Vampire King smiled, a small, knowing smile. "You begin by trusting me," he said. "And you begin by trusting yourself." The next few days were spent in intense training. She was taught how to harness her newfound strength, how to control the magic that ran through her veins. The Vampire King was patient, but firm. He pushed her harder than she had ever been pushed before, testing her limits, making her face the darkness within herself. She struggled at first. The power that surged through her was overwhelming, almost too much to bear. But with each lesson, she grew stronger, more confident. She began to understand the power she held, and she began to understand what it meant to be his queen. She was no longer the girl who had made a promise to a king. She was becoming something more, something greater. But with each step she took toward her destiny, a shadow of doubt lingered in the back of her mind. She had agreed to this, yes, but what would it cost her? What would she have to sacrifice to fulfill the promise she had made so many years ago? The answer was something she wasn't ready to face yet, but she knew one thing for sure. There was no turning back. She was becoming something new, something powerful. And no matter what lay ahead, she was ready to embrace it. The days following her training were both intense and transformative. She had learned to control the power within her, and every lesson with the Vampire King brought her closer to the destiny she had once only dreamed of. However, despite her progress, doubt still lingered in her heart. Could she truly fulfill the promise she made as a child? Was she ready for the responsibility that would come with the title of queen? These questions haunted her even as she stood beside the Vampire King, training under his watchful eyes. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the castle's stone walls, the Vampire King summoned her to the throne room. She had grown accustomed to the ritual by now, but this time, the air felt different. There was a tension in the room, a sense of anticipation. She entered the chamber, her heart racing. The Vampire King stood at the far end of the room, his back to her, gazing out of a tall window that overlooked the darkening landscape. His silhouette was framed by the faint light from the moon, and for a moment, he seemed like a shadow, distant and untouchable. She approached him cautiously, her footsteps echoing in the silence. "You have made great progress," he said, his voice low and commanding. But there is still more to learn. She nodded, her mind already focused on the task ahead. What do I need to do? The Vampire King turned to face her, his red eyes piercing through the dim light. You are ready to take the next step, he said. But first, you must prove your loyalty. You must prove that you are worthy of the power that lies within you. Her heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The Vampire King's lips curled into a faint smile, though it was one that held no warmth. You must face the trials of the throne, he said. Only then will you be ready to claim your place at my side. Her mind raced. The trials of the throne? What did that entail? She had trained for so long. But the thought of facing something more dangerous, something unknown, sent a wave of fear through her. What are the trials? She asked, her voice trembling. The Vampire King's gaze softened, though there was still a hardness to it. The trials are designed to test your strength, your will, and your ability to lead. You must prove that you can rule, not just by my side, but on your own. She swallowed hard. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. To rule, to become queen. She had dreamed of this moment, but now that it was within reach, it seemed more daunting than ever. What do I need to do? She asked again, determination rising within her. The Vampire King stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. You will face 3 trials, he said. The first will test your physical strength. The second will test your mind. And the third will test your heart. His words were like a blade, cutting through her doubts. If you can pass all 3 trials, you will be ready to rule. But if you fail, you will never sit on the throne. The gravity of his statement hung in the air, and she could feel the weight of it pressing down on her chest. I understand, she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. I will not fail. The Vampire King studied her for a moment, his eyes narrowing as if assessing her every word. Good, he said finally. Then the first trial begins tomorrow at dawn. The next morning, she stood before the gates of the castle, ready to face the first trial. The Vampire King was there, watching her from a distance, his eyes cold and calculating. The trial was simple in appearance. A vast arena, surrounded by stone walls, with only a small wooden platform in the center. But she knew better than to underestimate it. The first trial was a test of strength, and she would need every ounce of power she had gained in her training. As she stepped into the arena, the gates closed behind her, and the air seemed to grow colder. A horn sounded in the distance, signaling the start of the trial. She looked around, but there was no sign of any opponent. Only silence. And then it came. From the shadows, a massive creature emerged, its red eyes glowing like embers. It was a beast of nightmares, tall, with claws that could rip through stone, and teeth sharp enough to tear through steel. The creature roared, and she felt the ground shake beneath her feet. Her heart raced, but she stood her ground. This was the trial of strength, and she would not back down. The creature lunged at her with terrifying speed, its claws reaching for her. She dodged, narrowly avoiding the swipe, and summoned the power within her. She was ready. The fight was long and grueling, each strike from the creature sending shockwaves through her body. But she fought with everything she had, using the strength she had gained from her training. In the end, she managed to strike the creature down, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she stood victorious. The Vampire King watched from the edge of the arena, his expression unreadable. She had passed the first trial, but there were still 2 more to face. The road ahead was long, and she knew that she would need more than strength to claim her place by his side. The first trial had tested her physical strength, but she knew that the hardest part was yet to come. As she stood in the arena, panting and bruised from the battle, she glanced over at the Vampire King, who stood silently at the edge, watching her with those piercing crimson eyes. There was no sign of approval, no sign of satisfaction, just a cold, calculating stare. She had passed, yes, but this was just the beginning. You've shown you have the strength, he said finally, his voice as emotionless as ever. But strength alone will not make you a ruler. You must be more than just a warrior. You must be able to think, to plan, to rule with intelligence. His words hung in the air like a challenge, and she felt a knot form in her stomach. The second trial was a test of the mind, and she had no idea what to expect. The arena gates opened once more, and the Vampire King gestured for her to follow him. We move to the next trial, he said, his voice filled with authority. She followed him through the castle's labyrinthine halls, each step echoing in the silence. The castle was vast, filled with ancient stone corridors that seemed to stretch on forever. She felt like she was walking deeper into a world she barely understood, a world that was not meant for someone like her. Finally, they reached a small, dimly lit room. The Vampire King motioned for her to enter, and she stepped inside. The room was empty except for a small table at the center, upon which lay a strange-looking book. The pages were old, yellowed with age, and the symbols on the cover were unfamiliar to her. "This is the Book of Shadows," the Vampire King explained, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "Within it lies the knowledge of the Ancient Ones, those who ruled before us. To pass the second trial, you must solve the riddle of the book. Fail, and you will be cast aside." The room seemed to grow colder as the words sank in. A riddle. She had faced many challenges before, but this was different. This trial required something she wasn't sure she had: the ability to think like a ruler. The Vampire King stepped back, his gaze fixed on her. "The riddle is hidden within the pages," he said. "You must decipher it and prove that you can wield knowledge as well as strength." She took a deep breath and stepped closer to the table. The Book of Shadows felt heavy in her hands as she opened it, the ancient pages creaking in protest. She scanned the first page and immediately felt a sense of unease. The words were written in a language she did not understand, but something deep inside her stirred. She could feel the power of the book, the weight of its centuries of knowledge pressing down on her. She ran her fingers over the symbols, trying to make sense of them. The more she studied, the more the symbols seemed to shift before her eyes, like they were alive. She realized that this was no ordinary book. It was a test, a puzzle that required more than just intelligence. It required an understanding of the very essence of power. Time passed, though it felt like mere minutes, and she was no closer to solving the riddle. The pressure of the trial weighed heavily on her shoulders, but she refused to give in. Her mind raced, piecing together fragments of what she had learned during her training. She thought back to the Vampire King's lessons, the way he had spoken about the importance of knowledge and foresight. Rulers were not just warriors. They were thinkers, strategists, able to foresee the consequences of their decisions. Slowly, she began to make sense of the symbols. They were not just random markings. They were clues, guiding her toward the answer. She felt a spark of recognition and excitement as the solution began to unfold before her. With a steady hand, she traced the final symbol, and as she did, the book suddenly snapped shut. The room fell silent. The Vampire King's cold gaze softened slightly, though his expression remained as unreadable as ever. "You have passed the second trial," he said, his voice low. "But there is still one final trial. The trial of the heart." She felt a lump form in her throat as his words echoed in her mind. The trial of the heart. What did that even mean? She had passed the trials of strength and mind, but the heart? What could that possibly entail? The Vampire King studied her for a moment before turning and walking toward the door. "Follow me," he commanded. She followed him out of the room and through the castle, her mind still racing with questions. What would the final trial hold? Would she be able to pass it? The Vampire King led her to a secluded courtyard, bathed in the soft glow of moonlight. In the center of the courtyard stood a stone pedestal, and on top of it, a single, gleaming red rose. The air was still, and she could feel a strange sense of calm wash over her as she approached the pedestal. The Vampire King's voice broke the silence. "This is the trial of the heart. You must take the rose," he said. "But there is a catch. If you take it, you will be bound to me forever. Your heart will belong to me, and you will be unable to escape my power. You will be my queen in every sense of the word." She stared at the rose, its petals glowing softly in the moonlight. This was the final test. It was not about strength or intellect. It was about her willingness to surrender herself to the Vampire King, to give up everything she had ever known in exchange for power. The decision was hers to make. Would she take the rose and bind herself to him forever? Or would she walk away, knowing that she could never be his queen? The moonlight bathed the courtyard in a soft, ethereal glow, making the red rose on the pedestal appear almost otherworldly. It shimmered as if alive, its delicate petals beckoning her closer. The Vampire King stood a few steps behind her, his eyes never leaving her face, his expression unreadable. He had given her the choice, a choice that would forever change her life. The rose, a symbol of power, of destiny, and of the final trial. Her heart pounded in her chest as she took a step forward, her gaze fixed on the rose. She could feel the weight of the decision, the pressure of what it meant to take it. This was not just a test of strength or intelligence, it was a test of her very soul. Could she give herself fully to him? Could she embrace the dark future that awaited her? She thought back to everything she had gone through to get here. The battles, the training, the trials. She had fought so hard to prove herself, to show that she could stand by his side. But now, this was different. This was not about power or strength. This was about love. Or at least, what she believed could be love. But could she truly love someone like the Vampire King? He was powerful, yes, but he was also cold, distant, a being whose world was far removed from hers. She had always dreamed of being by his side, of ruling with him, but now that the moment had arrived, she felt the fear of what it would mean to actually take that step. "What if I refuse?" she asked softly, her voice trembling slightly. The Vampire King did not move, did not flinch. His gaze remained steady, unwavering. "You will never know the power you are capable of," he replied, his voice low and almost sorrowful. "You will never know what it means to truly rule, to be free from the chains that bind you to the life you left behind." His words were like a spell, drawing her closer to the rose, to him. The temptation was powerful, the promise of power, of a life unlike anything she had ever known. But in the back of her mind, a voice whispered doubts. Was this truly what she wanted? Was this the life she had imagined? Or had she simply been swept up in the allure of his world? Her heart raced as she reached out, her fingers hovering just above the rose. The petals seemed to pulse, as if waiting for her touch. The air around her grew heavy, charged with an energy she could feel deep within her bones. She could feel it now, the power. It was close, just within her grasp. But at what cost? She glanced back at the Vampire King, his eyes still fixed on her, unreadable. The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken words. The choice was hers. She could take the rose, bind herself to him, and step into the world of darkness and power that he offered. Or she could walk away, leaving behind everything she had fought for. Her mind spun, torn between the two options. She thought of the life she had left behind, the village, the struggles, the dreams of something more. She had always dreamed of a better life, one where she could rise above her circumstances. But now, that dream was here, right in front of her, and it was more than she had ever imagined. It was a dream that came with a price. The Vampire King had given her everything: strength, power, the promise of a future. But in return, she would have to give herself completely to him. There was no going back. Slowly, she lowered her hand and touched the rose. The moment her fingers made contact with the soft petals, a shock ran through her body, like electricity coursing through her veins. The world seemed to shift around her, and she felt a deep, primal connection to the rose, to the power that it represented. She could feel it. Her heart, her soul, everything was bound to him now. The Vampire King stepped forward, his gaze softening ever so slightly. "You have made the right choice," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You are mine now, as I am yours." Her breath caught in her throat as the reality of what she had done settled over her. She had given herself to him, completely. There was no turning back now. But even as fear gripped her, she felt something else, something powerful, something she had never felt before. It was as if a part of her had finally awakened, something that had been dormant within her all this time. She was no longer the girl from the village. She was his queen now, bound to him by the power of the rose, by the choices she had made. And as the Vampire King reached out to take her hand, she felt a surge of anticipation. This was just the beginning. The life she had always dreamed of was finally hers, but it came with a price she was now willing to pay. The Vampire King's words lingered in the air as she stood beside him, her hand still gripping the rose, her heart racing with the weight of the decision she had just made. The power within her was undeniable now, coursing through her veins like a living thing. She had chosen him. She had chosen this life. And as the Vampire King's gaze softened, a small part of her wondered if she had made the right choice. But there was no turning back now. The air around them crackled with energy, and she could feel the castle respond to the power she had embraced. It was as if the very walls of the castle recognized her new place in this world. She was no longer just a girl from a small village. She was the Vampire King's queen, bound to him by the magic of the rose and the promise she had made so many years ago. The Vampire King stepped closer, his cold fingers brushing her cheek, sending a shiver down her spine. "You have chosen wisely," he murmured, his voice low and smooth. "Now, your true training begins." His words sent a chill through her. True training? Hadn't she already proven herself? She had passed the trials of strength and intellect. She had taken the rose and bound herself to him. But now she realized that the real challenge was only just beginning. He led her through the castle's winding corridors, deeper into the heart of the fortress. The walls were adorned with ancient tapestries, the air heavy with the scent of incense and the faint echo of forgotten voices. They finally reached a vast chamber, larger than any room she had seen before. The ceiling stretched high above them, and the walls were lined with mirrors that reflected the flickering candlelight. In the center of the room stood a large stone pedestal, upon which rested a dark, shimmering object. It was a crown, the crown of the Vampire Queen. The Vampire King turned to her, his eyes piercing and intense. "This is your birthright," he said, his voice resonating in the cavernous room. "This is what you are meant to wear. This is what you must take to solidify your claim." Her breath caught in her throat as she approached the pedestal. The crown gleamed in the dim light, its black gems catching the reflection of the candles. It was beautiful and terrifying at once, a symbol of power and control, a symbol of everything she had ever dreamed of. But as her fingers brushed against the cold metal, she felt something stir within her, an instinctive fear. Was she truly ready for this? Could she bear the weight of ruling beside him, of sharing the throne with someone so powerful, so ancient? The Vampire King stepped forward, his gaze never leaving her. "You have already made your choice," he reminded her, his voice low and commanding. "You are bound to me. Now, you must prove you can wield this power." She hesitated, but only for a moment. The crown was her destiny. She had always known it, even before she had made that fateful promise. She lifted the crown, its weight heavier than she had anticipated, and placed it upon her head. A surge of power shot through her, a wave of magic that left her breathless. She felt the room spin, the mirrors flickering as if reacting to the power now coursing through her. The Vampire King watched, his expression unreadable. For a moment, she felt the overwhelming force of everything that was happening. She had chosen this path, but now, in the face of it, she questioned if she was truly ready. "You are the queen now," the Vampire King said, his voice cold and final. "And with that title comes responsibility. You will rule by my side, but you will also face the challenges that come with such power. You will be tested, just as you have been before." Her heart beat in her chest, the weight of his words sinking in. She had fought to get here, but the fight was far from over. This was only the beginning. The true test of her reign would not come from the trials she had already faced. It would come from the darkness that awaited her, both in the world and within herself. As she stood there, crowned and bound to him, she realized that her journey had only just begun. She had chosen power, but now she would have to prove that she could wield it. And the price of that power was not one she could yet comprehend. The Vampire King stepped closer, his cold hand resting on her shoulder. "Together, we will rule the night," he said, his voice a promise. "But remember, my queen, you are not just mine to command. You are mine to share this power with, and that is both a blessing and a curse." The words hung in the air, and for the first time, she wondered if she truly understood the depths of what she had entered into. But there was no turning back now. She was the Vampire Queen, bound by magic, power, and the promises of the past. And with the crown on her head, she would face whatever came next, for better or worse. The weight of the crown on her head felt heavier than it ever had before. As she stood beside the Vampire King, her heart raced, the gravity of her new reality settling in. She had embraced her destiny, but with that choice came a responsibility she had not fully understood until now. The power that coursed through her veins was intoxicating, but it was also isolating. She had been crowned, but the life she had imagined was far more complicated than she had ever dreamed. The Vampire King had made it clear that her reign would not be without its challenges. And as they stood in the grand hall of the castle, the weight of those words echoed in her mind. The air in the room grew thick, charged with an unspoken tension. The Vampire King's eyes, cold and calculating, met hers. "Now that you wear the crown, you must learn what it means to rule," he said, his voice low and commanding. "You will face enemies both within and outside these walls. There are those who will test your strength, who will seek to undermine your power. You must be ready." His words were not comforting. They were a reminder of the cost of power, of the battles she had yet to face. She had wanted this life, but now that she was standing at the edge of it, she wondered if she had truly been prepared for what was to come. "I understand," she said, though the uncertainty in her voice betrayed her. The Vampire King nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Good," he replied. "But remember, my queen, you are not just here to rule. You are here to lead. And leading means making decisions that are not always easy. There will be sacrifices, and you will have to make them, whether you are ready or not." His words hung in the air, each one like a weight pressing down on her chest. She had been prepared for the trials, for the strength and intellect required to earn the crown, but this, the responsibility of leadership, was something else entirely. "What do you expect of me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The Vampire King's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "I expect you to prove yourself," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Prove that you can command, that you can make the difficult decisions. You will face opposition from every corner. There will be those who doubt you, those who think you are not worthy of the throne." She stood tall, her eyes meeting his with newfound determination. "I will prove myself," she said, her voice steady. The Vampire King regarded her for a moment, then stepped back, his hands clasped behind his back. "We shall see," he said, his tone cryptic. "We shall see." In the days that followed, her life in the castle became a whirlwind of politics, strategy, and unforeseen challenges. The Vampire King was not just a ruler. He was a master of manipulation, a being who understood the delicate balance of power and control. He taught her the art of leadership, showing her how to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics. But with every lesson, she felt the pressure mounting. There were whispers in the halls of the castle, rumors of dissent among the vampire lords, of those who were dissatisfied with her sudden rise to power. She had never wanted to be the center of attention, had never craved the politics of the court, but now, she had no choice. She had to prove herself, to show the world that she could lead. One evening, as she sat in the throne room, studying maps of the vampire territories, a messenger arrived, breathless and urgent. He bowed low before her, holding a scroll tightly in his hand. "My queen," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "There is unrest in the northern territories. The vampire lords are gathering, and there are rumors of rebellion." The words hit her like a cold wave. Rebellion? Already? She had barely begun to settle into her role, and already, enemies were rising against her. The Vampire King had warned her, but now that the threat was real, the weight of it felt suffocating. She glanced at the messenger, her mind racing. "What are they demanding?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm brewing within her. The messenger swallowed, clearly hesitant to speak. "They demand your removal, my queen. They do not recognize your claim to the throne. They believe you are not fit to rule." The room seemed to close in around her as she absorbed the full weight of his words. Her mind raced, but one thought stood out above all others. She could not back down now. She had fought for this, and she would not let it slip away so easily. The Vampire King had given her the tools, had shown her the path to power, but now it was up to her to take control. "Prepare the army," she said, her voice firm. "I will not be intimidated by threats. If they wish to challenge my rule, they will find that I am ready to defend it." The messenger hesitated, but then bowed and hurried away to carry out her orders. The Vampire King stepped forward, his eyes glinting with a mixture of approval and intrigue. "You are learning, my queen," he said, his voice low. "But remember, this is only the beginning. There will be many more tests, many more challenges, and you will have to face them alone." She looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. "I will face them," she said, her voice steady. "And I will not fail." The Vampire King's lips curled into a smile, though it was a smile that held no warmth. "We shall see," he said again, his voice echoing in the quiet room. The battle for her reign had begun, and there was no turning back now. The stakes were higher than ever, and she was determined to prove herself worthy of the crown. She was not just his queen, she was her own ruler, and she would fight to the end to claim her place on the throne. The days after the rebellion was announced felt like a storm was raging inside her. The vampire queen had never known a life without conflict, but now it was her throne on the line, and she had to stand strong. The first wave of attacks came swiftly. Northern vampire lords, long dissatisfied with the new reign, had banded together to challenge her rule. They gathered their forces, their whispers of rebellion becoming a tangible threat. Her heart raced as she stared at the map of her kingdom, laying out the northern territories that were now lost to her. She could feel the weight of her crown, heavier than it had ever been before. She had thought the trials would be the hardest part, but the reality of ruling was far more daunting. She had chosen this life, but now, standing at the precipice of battle, she realized how high the stakes truly were. The vampire king had not yet spoken of the rebellion, but she knew he was watching, waiting to see how she would handle the situation. His silence was not one of indifference, it was a test. And this was her moment to prove that she could stand on her own, without relying on his power or guidance. She had made a vow to herself to never be the weak, uncertain girl she had once been. The day the enemy forces finally arrived, she stood at the forefront of her army, feeling the weight of every pair of eyes on her. The vampire king had instructed her to take charge, to lead her forces with the same power and strength he had always shown. The battlefield was massive, filled with the sounds of clashing swords, the cries of soldiers, and the growl of beasts. The northern lords had come with their own armies, vampires, warriors, and dark creatures at their side. But she had her own army, and they were not to be underestimated. The battle was fierce, the ground littered with fallen soldiers, both vampire and human alike. She fought like a storm, her sword cutting through enemies with the precision of a master. But even in the heat of battle, her mind never strayed far from the one thing that mattered above all else, protecting her throne. She could feel the weight of her decision as she fought, the realization that this was not just a fight for survival, but for her very place in the world. As the hours passed, the tide of the battle shifted. Her forces, though fewer in number, were stronger, fueled by the conviction that their queen would not fall without a fight. The vampire king's teachings, his trials, had prepared her for this moment. Her mind was sharp, her moves calculated. She was no longer the girl who had made a simple promise to a king in a distant forest. She was the vampire queen, a ruler in her own right. By the time the sun began to set, the northern lords had retreated, their forces scattered and broken. The battlefield, once filled with chaos, was now silent. She stood amidst the aftermath, her chest heaving with exhaustion, her sword slick with blood. The victory was hers, but it came at a cost. The land was scarred, and her soldiers were weary. But she had proven herself. She had protected her throne, and in doing so, she had secured her place as queen. The vampire king appeared from the shadows, his eyes scanning the battlefield with a mixture of approval and something darker, something unreadable. "You have done well," he said, his voice low and steady. "But remember, this is only the beginning. There will be more battles, more tests. You must continue to prove your worth, both to your enemies and to me." His words stung, but she held her ground, refusing to show weakness. "I will," she said, her voice unwavering. "I will protect this throne with everything I have." The vampire king nodded, his expression still unreadable. "Very well," he said. "You are ready, my queen. But the challenges will never stop. You will face many more trials, some you cannot even imagine. But remember this, ruling is not just about strength. It is about control. And control, my queen, is the key to everything." His words hung in the air, and she could feel the weight of them. She had won the battle, but the war was far from over. She was the vampire queen, and she would continue to fight for her reign. She had chosen this life, and now, with every victory and every loss, she would prove that she was worthy of the throne. The days after the battle were quiet, but they were far from peaceful. The rebellion had been quelled, and her enemies had been forced to retreat, but the price of victory was heavy. The northern territories were scarred, the land littered with the remains of fallen warriors and the memories of lives lost. Yet, as the vampire queen stood in the aftermath, something inside her stirred, something that had begun to change within her after the first taste of real power. She had secured the throne, but she knew that maintaining it would be even harder. The vampire king's lessons had prepared her for battles of the body, but not for those of the heart and mind. She had faced her first trial of strength, and though she had emerged victorious, she felt the pressure mounting. Every move she made was scrutinized, every decision weighed with consequences that could shift the balance of power. The castle's halls, once filled with whispers of her enemies, now echoed with silence, a different kind of tension hanging in the air. Her council was eager to meet, and she knew they had their doubts. They had seen her battle on the field, but ruling was a different challenge altogether. She could feel their eyes on her as she entered the grand meeting hall. The lords and ladies of the vampire courts stood in a semicircle, waiting for her to speak. Her gaze swept over them, the familiar faces that had once looked at her with disdain now uncertain, unsure of the queen they had in their midst. "My queen," one of the older lords said, his voice reverberating through the room. "Your victory was impressive, but we must address the matter of the future. The northern territories are still unstable, and rumors of further insurrection persist. We cannot afford to be weak." His words were sharp, his tone challenging. He had never been one to hide his disdain for her assent, but now, it seemed he was testing her, seeing if she had the strength to command. She straightened her posture, her crown heavy upon her head. "The northern territories will be dealt with," she replied, her voice steady. "And I will make sure that the rebellion is not allowed to spread. But the true threat is not from our enemies outside these walls, but from those within. I am the queen now, and I will lead, whether you approve or not." The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. The council members exchanged glances, some uncertain, others more defiant. But she had made her point. She would not be intimidated by their doubts, not anymore. "You have proven yourself in battle," another voice called out from the back. "But we need to know more. You must show us that you can govern, that you can command with both strength and wisdom." She turned toward the speaker, her eyes narrowing. "You are correct," she said, her voice cold and precise. "You all want proof that I am worthy of this crown, and I will show you. But understand this, my rule will be one of power and authority. If you do not stand with me, you will stand against me." The tension in the room was palpable, the silence deafening as the lords and ladies exchanged murmurs. Finally, the vampire king stepped forward, his presence commanding the attention of the room. "Enough," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "She is the queen now. You will respect her rule, or you will face the consequences." His words were final, and no one dared to argue. The council reluctantly bowed their heads, acknowledging her as their queen. But the weight of leadership had only just begun to settle on her shoulders. As the council dispersed, she felt the vampire king's eyes on her, watching her with a gaze that held both pride and something darker, something that she could not quite place. "You did well," he said quietly, his voice low. "But this is just the beginning. The hardest part is yet to come." She turned to him, her heart pounding. "What do you mean?" she asked. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "The lords will bow now, but they will test you, every day. They will challenge you, try to break your will. If you want to keep the throne, you must stay strong, no matter what." She nodded, determination rising in her chest. "I will stay strong. I will not let them take this from me." The vampire king smiled, a cold, calculating smile. "Good. You are learning. But remember, power is not just about strength. It is about control. And control, my queen, is the hardest thing to master." His words lingered in the air as he turned to leave, his dark cloak sweeping behind him. She stood in the room, alone, her mind racing with everything she had learned. The trials of strength, the tests of intellect, those had been simple compared to the battle for control. The real struggle had only just begun. She was the vampire queen, but now, she had to prove that she could rule not just with power, but with control. The lords were watching, the people were watching, and the vampire king, her only ally, was watching too. And she knew that one wrong move could cost her everything. But she was ready. She had to be. The days that followed were filled with tension. The lords had reluctantly bowed to her rule, but she knew that their compliance was fragile. The vampire king had warned her. This was just the beginning. The true test of her reign would be in how she maintained control over the throne and how she navigated the dangerous political waters that ran deep within the vampire court. She had already seen the cracks in her council's loyalty, the subtle whispers and side glances that suggested they were still skeptical of her ability to lead. It would take more than just winning battles to prove her worth. The castle, once a symbol of power, now felt like a cage, each stone and shadow reminding her of the weight of the crown she wore. Her every step was watched, every decision questioned. She could feel their eyes on her as she walked the halls, waiting for her to falter, for her to make a mistake. The pressure was immense, but she had no choice but to face it head-on. One evening, as she sat alone in her chambers, studying the map of her territories, a sudden knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She looked up to find a messenger standing in the doorway, his face pale with concern. "My queen," he said, bowing. "Lo, there is news from the southern borders. A rebellion has begun to stir among the human settlements. They are calling for your removal." Her heart sank. A rebellion among humans? She had expected resistance from the vampire lords, but humans? The very people who had long served the vampire kingdom were now rising up against her. It was a challenge she had not anticipated, but one that she could not ignore. "What are their demands?" she asked, trying to steady her voice. "They demand the removal of the vampire rule," the messenger replied. "They say that the vampires no longer care for the well-being of the humans. They want independence, to be free from our control." Her mind raced. The human rebellion was a new threat, one that could fracture the very foundation of her rule. If the humans rose against her, it would mean more than just a loss of territories. It could mean the beginning of the end of her reign. She had been crowned as a queen of vampires, but the humans were just as crucial to the kingdom's stability. She couldn't afford to let this rebellion grow. "Prepare the army," she ordered, standing up with determination. "I will not let this rebellion spread. We will restore order, and I will ensure that my rule is not questioned." The messenger nodded and rushed off to carry out her commands. As the door closed behind him, she felt the weight of her decision settle over her. The vampire king had already warned her that ruling would be fraught with challenges. She would face betrayals, uprisings, and tests of her strength and resolve. But this rebellion was something she had not been prepared for. She was a queen of vampires, but could she also be a queen of the humans? Could she unite both sides under her rule, or would her reign be divided? She had no answers yet, but one thing was clear. The time for hesitation was over. She had to act, and she had to act fast. The next day, she gathered her forces and marched to the southern borders. The journey was long and fraught with uncertainty. As they approached the rebel camp, she could hear the sounds of shouting, of people gathering in defiance. Her heart beat heavily in her chest as she prepared to face the leader of this human uprising. When they arrived, she found the rebel leader waiting for her, standing at the head of a small army of human fighters. He was a tall man, with sharp features and fiery eyes that showed no fear. "So, the vampire queen has come to stop us," he said, his voice filled with disdain. "Do you think you can control us as you control your vampires?" She stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. "I do not wish to control you," she replied, her voice steady. "I wish to unite our kingdoms, to show that there is a future where we can coexist." The rebel leader scoffed, crossing his arms. "Coexist? The vampires have enslaved us for centuries. You think we'll trust you because you wear that crown?" His words stung, and for a brief moment, doubt crept into her mind. But she quickly pushed it aside. "I do not ask for trust," she said firmly. "I ask for your loyalty. But I will not tolerate rebellion. You have a choice: submit and join me in building a new kingdom, or face the consequences of defying the throne." The rebel leader laughed, his eyes cold. "You may be the queen of vampires, but you will never be our queen." Her heart tightened, but she knew there was no other choice. She couldn't let this rebellion continue unchecked. She turned to her army, signaling them to prepare for the fight. The battle was fierce, the human rebels fighting with a desperation born of years of oppression. But the vampire forces, led by their queen, fought with precision and strength. It wasn't long before the rebels were forced to surrender, their leader captured. As the battle ended and the dust settled, she stood over the fallen rebel leader, her heart heavy with the cost of her victory. She had won, but at what price? The human rebellion had been crushed, but the seed of unrest had been planted. Her rule was not just about commanding the vampires. It was about uniting the kingdom as a whole, humans and vampires alike. As she looked over the battlefield, she knew that her journey was far from over. This victory was just one chapter in a much larger story, and the real test of her reign was yet to come. The days following the rebellion's defeat were tense, but necessary. Her victory had solidified her position as queen, but the cost weighed heavily on her. The human uprising had been crushed, but their resentment lingered, and the vampire lords, while subdued for now, remained restless. The castle felt more like a cage with each passing day, and every decision she made seemed to echo through the halls, with eyes constantly on her. The vampire king had given her the crown, but the true test of leadership had only just begun. She could feel it, the pressure of every pair of eyes in the kingdom, the expectations of both vampires and humans alike. She had quelled the rebellion, but could she truly unite the two worlds? Could she be the ruler they all needed, or would the divisions between them tear her kingdom apart? The vampire king had stayed mostly in the shadows, watching, waiting, a silent presence in her life. She had asked for his guidance, but his response had been the same each time. You must rule. You must learn to lead on your own. And so she had. She had made the hard decisions, silenced the dissenters, and proved that she could fight for her throne. But now, with the rebellion crushed and her enemies subdued, she found herself at a crossroads. There was no enemy left to fight, no battle to win. What did it mean to rule when there were no more wars to wage? The answer, she realized, was far more difficult than anything she had faced before. Ruling was not just about conquest. It was about maintaining control over a kingdom that was never fully unified. It was about governing the hearts and minds of those who followed her. She sat alone in her chambers, the weight of the crown pressing down on her. The throne had been hers, but the future remained uncertain. Could she bring the vampires and humans together, or would they forever remain divided, locked in an uneasy truce? The vampire king's voice broke through her thoughts, startling her. He appeared in the doorway, his figure dark and commanding. You have done well, he said, his eyes studying her carefully. But now, the real test begins. She looked up at him, her eyes tired but resolute. I know, she replied softly. The rebellion is over, but the real battle is for their hearts. He nodded, stepping closer. Exactly. They will never fully accept you unless you show them that you are worthy of their loyalty, not through power alone, but through wisdom, compassion, and control. You must unite them, not as ruler and subject, but as equals in a new order. His words lingered in the air, and for the first time, she felt a shift inside her. She had spent so much time focusing on power, on proving that she was strong enough to rule. But now, she realized, strength alone was not enough. She needed to show her people that she could lead with heart, not just with force. It was not just about conquering enemies. It was about conquering the doubts that plagued her kingdom. The road ahead would not be easy, but she was no longer the uncertain girl she had been. She had faced rebellion, made sacrifices, and emerged victorious. But victory alone was not enough. She had to build something lasting, something that would bring both vampires and humans together, something that would make her people believe in her as their queen. She stood up, a new sense of purpose filling her chest. I will do it, she said, her voice firm. I will unite them. I will show them that I can lead, not just with power, but with compassion. The vampire king regarded her for a long moment, his eyes searching her face. You are ready, he said finally. But remember, a ruler's greatest weapon is not their strength, but their ability to wield power with wisdom and fairness. You must be both the ruler and the servant of your people. His words echoed in her mind as he turned to leave. She stood there, her heart steady and her resolve firm. The war for the throne had been won, but the war for her people's trust was just beginning. The castle, once a place of tension and fear, now felt like a place of opportunity. It was time to move beyond the walls, beyond the battles, and begin the true work of leadership. She would not be defined by her past victories, nor by the battles she had won. She would be defined by how she built the future, a future where vampires and humans could coexist in peace. She walked to the window of her chambers, gazing out over the kingdom she had fought so hard to claim. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the land. It was a new day, and with it came a new beginning. The vampire queen had won the throne, but now she would rule it with wisdom, compassion, and strength. And she would never stop fighting for her people, not just for the vampires, but for every soul in her kingdom. She had made the promise all those years ago, and now she would see it through. No matter what came next, she was ready to lead. Vampire stories often captivate readers with their mix of intrigue, dark magic, and powerful emotions, and this tale is no exception. Follow the journey of a young woman who ascends to the throne after an unexpected rise to power. As she navigates the challenges of ruling both vampires and humans, the struggles she faces are reminiscent of classic vampire stories, where power, betrayal, and destiny intertwine. In these vampire stories, the quest for control, loyalty, and the fight for the throne never fails to create a gripping narrative. The protagonist must confront rebellion, political alliances, and the pressure of ruling a fractured kingdom, drawing readers deeper into a world where power is both a gift and a curse. As the story unfolds, the protagonist discovers that true leadership comes not just from strength, but from wisdom and the ability to unite even the most divided factions, which is a key element in many vampire stories. This journey will keep you on the edge of your seat as it brings together the most thrilling aspects of vampire stories: action, emotion, and an unrelenting pursuit of power.